And I'm joined today by Jennifer Pullen, our excellent map dashboard coordinator. And if you have any comments or questions about the content that you find on the dashboard, you can contact Jennifer at the email you see on the screen. So we'll start with webinar details. Now, the Map Talk will be recorded. We'll be posting the recording later today or tomorrow. Second of all, keep in mind that we are going to operate the webinar in conference mode. That means that everyone except the presenter will be muted. Now, if you'd like to ask a question, we'll save time at the end of the webinar. And you can also email me anytime at ghammond@email.arizona.edu. Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure that we thank our sustaining sponsors, which are Tucson Electric Power, the Thomas R. Brown Foundations, and the Freeport-McMoran Foundation. And of course, I also need to thank our excellent partners, the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, the Pima Association of Governments, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corridor, and the University of Arizona. I also want to make sure you know that the Map Dashboard is an award-winning project. Our most recent award comes from the International Community Indicators Consortium. And in 2018, they awarded the Map Dashboard their 2018 Community Impact Award. We're really happy about that. I also want to make sure you know that you can find Map Dashboard content in the Arizona Daily Star, another partner of the dashboard. You'll find dashboard content on the front page of the Sunday business section once a month, and you'll also find Map Dashboard content in the health section in the first Monday of each month. So be sure and check that out. Now, in addition to the core data that's available on the dashboard, we also produce a large number of what we call feature articles. And these cover a wide variety of topics that range from house prices in Tucson to housing affordability to housing cost burdens. You'll also find articles that compare Southern Arizona communities, so our cities and towns. And you'll find interesting articles on health, water independence, the power of innovation, and you also find articles on how local organizations are using the map. So be sure and check those out. We also, as part of the Map Dashboard, run a series of grants designed to fund research by University of Arizona faculty. And we're going to talk about some of that research today. So our topic again is the manufactured housing gap in Tucson and Pima County. I'm going to turn it over now to Mark Keir. He's an assistant professor in the School of Geography and Development. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, George. So I also want to point out that today's presentation is based on a white paper that was co-authored with Taylor Hanshu, who was an MSGIST student at the time, Sarah Lanius, who was a PhD student at the time and now a PhD at the City of Tucson, and two current PhD students, Julian Hartman and Dugan Meyer, and finally Gary Christofferson, who's the director of the Center for Applied Spatial Analysis at the School of Geography and Development here at the University of Arizona. I also want to mention that thanks to the MAP support, we've been able to grow this project into something a little bit more ambitious with the additional support of the Howry Program in Environment and Social Justice. Their support has allowed us to partner with Habitat for Humanity Tucson and the City of Tucson, in particular their Ward 3 and Ward 6 offices. Hopefully I'll have a little bit of an opportunity to talk about the collaboration that's happening there towards the end. And certainly, if you have any questions about that, I'll be happy to field those questions after the formal presentation. So what is the manufactured housing gap? Well, it's based on this sort of simple recognition that there's nothing inherently marginal about housing that's built in a factory, right? In fact, there are many reasons to believe that housing that's built in the controlled environment of a factory might be superior to site-built or stick-built housing. And indeed, there is a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for manufactured housing right now, mostly in the form of tiny homes or container homes. Indeed, there's even a level of utopianism around manufactured housing, but not under that rubric of manufactured housing. And that's partially because the lived reality for many people living in manufactured housing is that it fails to reach that promise. The lived reality is such that manufactured housing is often the nexus of a variety of social, financial, and environmental vulnerabilities. And what this project is about is trying to understand the nature of that gap, its geography, and how we might close that gap. So before getting into the details here, I just want to outline what we'll be talking about today. The first thing I want to do is to sort of contextualize why we should be particularly concerned about manufactured housing here in Tucson. Then I'll provide some images that spatialize this idea of the manufactured housing gap in Tucson and look at where we think that this manufactured housing gap is the widest. And then I want to complicate that idea that we can really know by just looking at traditional statistics where that gap would be the widest by explaining our framework around risk, vulnerability, and insecurity in manufactured housing. And then I want to close by thinking a little bit about how we might improve quality of life for manufactured housing residents in Tucson and beyond. So why should we care about closing the manufactured housing gap in Tucson? There are many reasons. One of the main reasons is that 10% of all housing units in Pima County are manufactured homes. And that's considerably more than what you would find in Tucson's other sort of western peer cities. That's more than twice the percentage of total housing units that you'd find in Phoenix. And it's dramatically more, I think, than in LA. I don't have the figures right in front of me here, but in LA it's close to 1.5%. Phoenix, it's around 4.4%. And Las Vegas and other cities in the Western United States don't cross that 5% threshold either. But the main reason that I think we should be particularly concerned about manufactured housing in Tucson is housing affordability. When I talk to people in Tucson, they typically think, oh, well, housing prices are much lower in Tucson than they are in other places. Tucson must not have a housing affordability problem. But it turns out that when you take into consideration income, and you look at the number of people that are spending larger than 30% of their income on housing, Tucson actually fares poorly compared to many of our Western peer cities. Nearly 35% of households in Tucson are spending 30% or more of their income on housing. And that's more than what you would find in cities that are often more popularly thought of as having really dynamic and high cost housing markets like Austin and Denver, for instance. And what's more, and this I'm drawing on the work that's been done by the MAP dashboard, is more acute in Tucson among lower income populations than among mid and higher income populations. So what I'm showing here in this figure is that for folks that are earning less than $20,000, nearly 15% are housing cost burdened, and compared to 11% for Arizona as a whole, or nearly 12% for Arizona as a whole, and nearly 12% for the US as a whole. And you see a gap that's not very favorable for Tucson also in this 20,000 to 35,000 range as well. I also want to point out that in addition to the fact that we have this housing cost burden problem right now in Tucson, there's evidence to suggest that it's getting worse. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies recently released its State of the Housing Stock. And one of the things it did in that report was it tracked how low-cost housing had changed, or the supply of low-cost housing had changed between 2011 and 2017. And what they found for the Tucson MSA is that the number of low-rent units actually declined from around 45,000 to 30,000 units. So that's a change of 33%. And this is important to consider because one of the forms of housing that typically fits the requirements or their definition of low rent housing is manufactured housing. This image here, this graph here is showing data for the nation as a whole, but you can see that whether or not you're an owner or a renter, manufactured housing is typically far more affordable than other housing types, at least when you compare it to detached housing and most multifamily housing as well. Okay, so these are the first figures I'm showing for manufactured housing in Tucson and Pima County. When we were doing the white paper, what we did was we took all of the land use codes for manufactured housing and we collapsed them into these 4 categories of park, co-op, subdivision, and subdivided lot. So pretty much everyone who's living in a park or a co-op is going to be paying some form of rent, right? So these are renters. And in the qualitative work that's followed from the white paper we did for MAP, we've come across very few people that are paying rents over that 525 low rent cutoff that mentioned by the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And what you can see here is that there are approximately 20,000 manufactured housing units that are in parks. We also have a lot of renters that are living in manufactured housing in subdivided lots as well. And so we can surmise that a very large portion of the low rent housing units that remain in Tucson, the estimated 30,000 low rent units that are remaining in Tucson, are manufactured homes. So when we're talking about housing affordability issues for low income populations in Tucson, we are, whether or not we realize it or not, talking about manufactured housing in large part. And what's more, and these are average incomes in block groups where manufactured housing is present. Manufactured housing residents tend to be in the most housing cost burdened income groups in Tucson. So when we're worried about housing cost burden, when we're worried about the supply of low cost housing in Tucson, more than in most other cities, we are talking about an issue of manufactured housing and its supply. Okay, so what is the geography of manufactured housing in Tucson and Pima County? This is just a dot density map where each of these dots corresponds to 10 units of manufactured housing. The purple dots or the lavender dots are manufactured homes that are titled as real property, and the blue dots are manufactured homes that are titled as personal property. So how do we narrow in on the manufactured homes that we should be concerned about? How do we how do we find the spaces of the city where we think that this manufactured housing gap, this gap between the promise of manufactured housing and the lived reality of manufactured housing is the widest? To do that, I want to sort of step back and introduce this framework where we understand the unique characteristics of manufactured housing risk, vulnerability, and insecurity. And that will allow us not only to think about where that manufactured housing gap is, but also to think more effectively about where we might intervene to increase quality of life or improve quality of life the most dramatically. So what is risk? Risk is just the possibility of an event, social, environmental, financial, that causes harm, okay? But just because you're at risk of experiencing some sort of harm, it doesn't mean you're vulnerable. Vulnerability is this sort of composite of your exposure to that risk, your sensitivity to that risk, plus your adaptive capacity in the face of that risk, right? And then even if you have a high level of exposure, you're very sensitive and you have limited adaptive capacity in the face of some harm, for whatever reason, that may not translate into increases in housing insecurity. And when we think about housing insecurity, what we're thinking of is a situation where someone has a home, but they face uncertainty about their ability to retain that residence for whatever reason. Okay, so I want to walk through a very quick example to show how risk translates into vulnerability, translates into insecurity, using environmental vulnerability. Okay, so what do you get when you think of manufactured housing and environmental vulnerability? Most people, the images that come to mind are flooding, right? And this is speaking to manufactured housing's tendency to be more exposed to the risk of flooding, right? Manufactured housing is more often located in flood zones and coastal areas. Oftentimes that's because other types of housing is not permitted in those areas. And then the very even more common association with manufactured housing is, the tipped over unit that's been hit by a tornado. And that's because sometimes these units, especially the older ones, are more susceptible to high winds. So you have a geography of an exposure with a more sensitive form of housing. Now, because of these strong associations, when I tell people that I'm working on manufactured housing and environmental vulnerability, they say, oh, well, Tucson mustn't be a very vulnerable place for manufactured housing. It must be a great place to be. But in fact, we have other types of environmental exposure that are more slow motion and less dramatic than flooding and wind damage. So I want to spend a little bit of time here thinking about climate vulnerability in manufactured housing. So most climate change projections suggest that the western border region is going to see substantial increases in the number of days above 100 degrees, and that when we have heat waves, they're going to become much longer in duration. So what we have is a geography of exposure, heat waves and days above 100 degrees, with a very sensitive structure that's inhabited by sensitive populations. And what I'm referring to here is the fact that in Pima County, 35% of all of the manufactured housing was built before 1976. And the reason 1976 is an important date is because that's before Housing and Urban Development introduced a code for all manufactured housing in the United States. And before that code, there were no strict regulations around insulation and wiring, which means that oftentimes these older units have very poor insulation and aluminum wiring, which can mean that you have very little adaptive capacity when you're experiencing heat waves or temperatures above 100 degrees. I've come across families living in these older units who have wanted to install air conditioners, but because the wiring in their home is so susceptible to shorting because it's the original aluminum wiring, they can't even install air conditioners. For those that are lucky enough to be able to install air conditioners, though, that's their primary adaptive capacity when they don't have a lot of insulation. And so what they do is they run their air conditioners day and night in a tin box that doesn't have very good insulation, which drives up their utility bills and creates housing cost burdens, right? So their adaptive capacity in the face of climate leads to higher costs and increased financial vulnerability and risk of eviction, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is not only the relationship between risk, vulnerability, and housing insecurity, but the fact that these different types of vulnerability all overlap, right? We have coupled and intersecting geographies of vulnerability. And our conjecture is that where you see these forms of social vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, and financial vulnerability overlapping in space is where we would expect the manufactured housing gap to be the widest. So how do we move from this sort of conceptual urban space that I have displayed here in the form of a Venn diagram to physical space? So the first step in that process is to create a location quotient for manufactured housing. And this is just a simple way of displaying the over or underrepresentation of manufactured housing on the landscape. Okay, so what we've done here, the lighter shaded areas are block groups. And a block group is simply, it's a geographic area defined by the US Census Bureau that's between a census tract and a census block, okay? So the lighter shaded areas are areas where there is less than the average amount of manufactured housing for that block group. And the purple shaded areas, there's overrepresentation of manufactured housing to different degrees. Okay, so how does this prevalence of manufactured housing on the landscape overlap with various socioeconomic indicators that we think might be associated with vulnerability? So I'm not going to go through all of the different indicators that we explored in our white paper, but I'm going to go through a few just to give you the idea of how this all works. Okay, so this is a bivariate map that's displaying the prevalence of manufactured housing on the landscape on this one scale here, right? With income per capita on the other scale. And so the block groups that we're the most concerned about are the block groups that have low income and the greatest overrepresentation of manufactured housing on the landscape. So this dark green shaded area, those block groups are the areas that we would be the most concerned about looking at just the overlap between where is manufactured housing and where are low income populations. So we've done this as well for education. So here again, the dark green area corresponds to areas of the city where there's an overrepresentation of manufactured housing and a low percentage of the population with a college degree. Here we have the dark shaded green area as areas where there's a low rate of labor force participation and an overrepresentation of manufactured housing. And here we're looking at the percent of the block group where the housing units are built prior to 1980. So really, again, what we're trying to get at here is 1976, but we weren't able to get that data from the American Housing Survey as easily. So what we settled for pre-1980. So this is where this dark purple area is where you have a low percentage, or sorry, here the dark green area corresponds to areas where we have a lot of housing units that are built prior to 1980 and a lot of manufactured housing. Okay. So the idea then is to step back and take all of the dark green shaded areas from each of the maps, and then from each of the bivariate maps, and then overlap those spaces of most concern in a new map, right? So that the areas the block groups that are identified as areas of concern in the most number of bivariate maps will be deemed the most vulnerable spaces for manufactured housing. I hope this is clear. I'm happy to answer any questions about this at the end of the presentation. And when we do that, we produce this map. Okay, so here in the right panel, we've tried to display as much of the county and Tucson MSA as we can. And in these central panels here, we have the main clusters of manufactured housing in Flowing Wells, down here between the I-10 and the highway and the airport, and then over here between I-19 and Mission Road, right? So you can see we have this gradation of manufactured housing of greatest concern. So we would expect the darkest green areas to be the areas where the manufactured housing gap is the widest. In other words, where you have an overlap between manufactured housing, high levels of overlap between manufactured housing, low income, low levels of educational attainment, lots of older structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really important, and this is sort of where our white paper ends and our new research project sort of takes off. It's important to recognize that we can't conclude that all manufactured housing residents within block groups of high concern or vulnerable block groups are housing insecure, right? And there are lots of reasons for this, but the two main ones are that our indicators of vulnerability are constructed from secondary data that are indirect measures, right? This is aggregated at the block group level, so it's not talking about individuals, individual residents or individual parks or manufactured housing communities. And not every resident of a vulnerable block group is going to have the same adaptive capacity, same sensitivity or exposure to social, environmental, and financial risks. And to figure out whether or not someone is actually insecure within a high vulnerability or high concern block group, we actually have to go out and talk to people, right? This is where we need to sort of meld our quantitative analysis with qualitative analysis. So what we would expect is that as our indicators of vulnerability suggest more vulnerability, that we would find more people in those block groups that are experiencing housing insecurity, right? And I imagine that will be the majority of instances. Most residents that are, as the block groups they're living in, are implied to be more vulnerable based on traditional data sources. We're going to find more housing in people that are experiencing housing insecurity in those areas. But we're also going to get some outliers. We're going to find people that are in ostensibly low vulnerability block groups that for whatever reason are experiencing high levels of insecurity in their manufactured housing. And we're also going to get folks who are in high vulnerability block groups that for whatever reason are not experiencing very much housing insecurity. So that latter group we've chosen to refer to as resilient manufactured housing communities. And these are communities and residents that we might use as models for other communities, which is something that I think we should be thinking about in Tucson as we work to preserve and improve the existing manufactured housing that we have, and even to start thinking about building more of it. Okay, so I want to close by talking about one example. This is a fictionalized example of an actual existing park. I'm going to call it Sunbird Shores. And it is located in one of the block groups of greatest concern in the Flowing Wells area. It's a 55-plus park, which means that there are many reasons to think that the residents would be vulnerable. They're on fixed incomes. There are many health and mobility issues. In this particular park, all of the units are titled as personal property. In other words, they don't own the land that their homes are on, which means that if they were evicted, they would not only have to find a new place to live, but they would lose their most valuable asset. It's a high density park where the units are pushed up right against each other. A large percentage of the units in this park were built before 1976, and so they would have these heating and cooling concerns, but also accessibility issues. You know, narrow doorways, narrow hallways, etc. But we have developed a relationship with Sunbird Shores. And what we've discovered is that the quality of life that exists there is really very high. And the things that we would expect to produce insecurity in their lives, they have developed sort of local solutions to. Okay. So really, it's a good example of a resilient park. And there are some factors that we think have been very important at producing the resilience of that park. One, there's been a long-term owner. It's been owned by the same family that doesn't own that many parks for decades now. The lot rent there is quite affordable. It's $425 a month, and this includes water, right, which is often over $100 a month. The managers have managed to keep the rent increases low. They claim they've kept the rent increases around 3% a year. Recently, the owners bought a nearby auto dealership lot and converted it into a solar field, and that solar field is producing an alternative income stream for the owners, but it's also providing power to the collective amenities there. So there are 2 swimming pools and 2 clubhouses that the residents make use of, and the power in those is provided by the solar array. There are also many clubs and social groups at this park and high collective amenity. There's actually a lake that's stocked with fish on the premises. That was a shock to me. You don't expect to see that in the middle of Tucson. And the one thing that really stuck out to me is that 1/3 of all the residents in this park belong to a statewide manufactured housing advocacy organization that actually pays for a lobbyist in Phoenix. And they're very aware of their rights as manufactured homeowners. Okay, so those are some things that I really want to emphasize. We cannot learn from traditional data sources, right? In order to understand why this place is resilient, we need to actually talk to people. And that's the stage we're at with this project right now. We're conducting interviews across the city. So if you know people that are living in manufactured housing, experiencing problems, but also who are very happy with their quality of life, please have them contact me, and I'll have that contact information at the end of today's presentation. But before we close things off, I just want to highlight a few conclusions from the from the MAP white paper. The first we've already been just talking about is the need for qualitative research, right? We have to have this sort of top-down approach that takes existing data and uses it to sort of tailor where we decide to do our qualitative sampling, but we need to combine that sort of top-down approach with a resident-up research design. The second thing I really want to emphasize is, yes, manufactured housing tends to be a nexus of social, environmental, and financial vulnerability, but where we see that intersection being the most pronounced is in these pre-1976 units. We see energy poverty, we see substandard housing, and we see a lot of regulatory challenges at both the city and the county level, and actually I would add the state level there. Right now, Arizona is really struggling about what to do with the high number of pre-1976 manufactured housing units that exist in the state and the county. Third is the need to overcome stigma. And here I'm not talking about, or at least not just about, the stigma that is often attached to people that live in manufactured housing. I'm talking about the stereotypes that people not living in manufactured housing have about manufactured housing. Typically, when I tell people that I'm working on quality of life in manufactured housing, the images they conjure are substandard housing and really rough conditions, which is actually a poor representation, I think, of what most manufactured housing communities look like. And as long as people have this strong association with undesirable housing conditions in manufactured housing, it's going to be very difficult to create the political will to build more of it, which is a problem because it is one of the best sources of affordable housing we have in the county right now. And I think it could, building more of it or figuring out how to build more good quality manufactured housing could be a way to improve quality of life in manufactured housing communities here in Pima County. We didn't really have much of an opportunity to dive into this in our white paper, but much of the manufactured housing in Pima County is rural. And I think that the issues facing manufactured housing in a rural environment is very different than what we are seeing in urban environments. That's something we need to explore. This is a couple more things. This is a big topic of interest of mine. We find that one of the things that really impairs the ability of people to purchase manufactured housing is a lack of financing available. Where it is available, it tends to be scarce and expensive. And so people that are not able to access traditional sources of credit are forced to rely on rent-to-own or contract sale arrangements, which are often two-party arrangements, usually with a park manager or owner. And we have no records of these things. So it's very hard to track what's going on in these markets, which is the fact that there are these sort of adaptations to credit constraint and credit scarcity is not inherently a bad thing, but we have seen a number of examples that raise concern in these areas. And then finally, there's a need to replace the pre-1976 housing that's on the landscape right now, preserve the good manufactured housing we have, and improve the existing stock, right? And figure out new models that we might be able to roll out to increase the supply of affordable housing and deal with housing cost burden in Pima County. So I'll stop there. Feel free to ask questions, but I just wanted to thank the MAP dashboard again for their support of this research. Really, it was your support that got this project going, and also our current partners with Habitat for Humanity, the Howry program, and the City of Tucson. Thanks very much. And you can contact me at mkear@email.arizona.edu.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really terrific. I'm going to unmute all of the attendees now, and as I do that, I'll kick the questions off. Ask Mark a question myself. Mark, is there any way that that you or your team have to track the evolution of manufactured home prices over time? Are you seeing those house prices rising? And how does those, if you are, how are those price increases comparing to what we see for kind of fixed?
Yeah, this is an issue that we have for research manufactured housing, is that there's not a lot of good data. Even when the data does exist, it's often not disaggregated according to whether or not it's manufactured housing or not. And there's some effort to change that. The Federal Housing Finance Administration is developing a manufactured housing price index right now. But that's, I think, only going back a couple years. And it's only looking at manufactured housing that's titled as real estate, which is not the majority. Most manufactured housing is titled as personal property.
Great. Well, that's great. We'll keep our eyes out for that data. And in terms of the kind of the prevalence of manufactured housing in Tucson, do you have a way to track how that's growing over time, and is that rising at a rapid rate compared to other types of housing?
You know what? We haven't looked at it over time. Our main tool for looking at the prevalence of manufactured housing is assessor data. So what we've done is we've created a database for manufactured housing, which has combined the assessor's real property database with its personal property database. And I think that's a worthwhile project to look at how that's changed over time. I can tell you at the national level, we're actually seeing parks at least disappearing. So it's a long term, and there are historical reasons for this, but municipalities tend not to look on manufactured housing and manufactured housing parks in particular as a desirable land use. And so there are a lot of constraints on the ability to produce new parks. But there is a conversion of these lower value land uses to higher value land uses happening in a lot of places. And so what we're seeing is that parks are disappearing. So I don't know what the numbers are, but I think that every year for, every 100 parks that are closed, maybe 10 are built. And I don't know those figures for Tucson specifically. And I think that a lot of those figures, these are figures that I've heard from industry groups, I think are largely conjecture.
Great, thanks, Mark. Any questions from the audience?
Hey, Mark, this is Jennifer. I have a question. I was wondering, I know you mentioned the example of the 55 plus, but I was wondering if there was data available on the age distribution of those living in manufactured homes. And what made me wonder that is when you spoke about environmental concerns in temperatures in Tucson and how vulnerable the older populations are to increases in temperature.
I think that data is available. We have not collected that data, but that's something to look at. Definitely, we've actually been having some challenges with our interview sampling because most of the folks that want to speak to us are older, have more time. So yeah, the perception that we have is that there is a large concentration of older folks living in manufactured housing in Tucson.
Yeah, I was just wondering how age might increase vulnerability, like you mentioned in the 55.
Yeah, I mean, study. I think you would think that it would, and there are a lot of reasons to believe that it would. But we found that some of the best examples of parks that have adaptive capacity, high levels of social capital, that are the best managed are 55 plus parks.
Okay. Great.
Thanks, Jennifer. Any other questions? Okay, well, hearing no other questions, I want to take this opportunity to thank Mark and his team for an excellent white paper and Mark for an excellent presentation. We really appreciate you talking about this important topic to us today. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please share it with your friends. We will have the recording up later today or tomorrow. So thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned to the MAP dashboard for new development and new webinars as we move through 2019 and into 2020. Thanks very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.